Welcome to our Explainer. Today, we're going to dig into a really challenging perspective on the origins of the war in Ukraine. It's an analysis that directly questions the dominant narrative, and we're going to deconstruct the argument that this conflict was, in fact, provoked.
You hear that word all the time, right? Unprovoked. It's the most common way the 2022 invasion is described. But the source material we're looking at today asks a pretty blunt question. Is that really the whole story? The argument here is that to truly get it, you have to rewind the clock and look at decades of decisions made far away from Ukraine.
So here's our roadmap. First, we'll dive into NATO expansion and the warnings that were apparently ignored. Then we'll hit the huge turning point in 2014. After that, we'll examine what the source calls a pattern of hypocrisy, and then we'll follow the money into the profits of war before we wrap it all up.
Okay, let's dive right in with the deep background. The source we're looking at kicks things off with NATO's expansion to the east, and it claims there were a lot of warnings that just got brushed aside. So what you're seeing here is this steady march right up to Russia's borders. The source argues that this all happened despite what it calls earlier promises to Moscow that the alliance wouldn't expand. You can see it, 1999, then a huge expansion in 2004, and then the big one in 2008. That's when NATO flat out declared that Ukraine would, one day, be a member.
You know, this wasn't some new hot take. This warning right here, it's from George Kennan, the guy who literally invented America's Cold War strategy of containment. All the way back in 1998, he was calling NATO expansion a tragic mistake that would absolutely provoke a bad reaction from Russia.
And it wasn't just retired diplomats. This is from a 2008 cable written by William Burns, the current director of the CIA. He was the ambassador to Russia at the time. And he was basically shouting from Moscow, telling Washington in no uncertain terms that for the entire Russian elite, not just Putin, bringing Ukraine into NATO was the absolute reddest of red lines.
So to put a fine point on it, scholars like John Mearsheimer, who are cited in our source, argue that this 2008 NATO pledge was the moment. It was the breaking point. From Moscow's perspective, the idea of Ukraine joining what they saw as a hostile military alliance was nothing short of an existential threat.
All right, so let's shift gears now. How did all this high-level geopolitical tension actually explode on the ground? Well, the analysis points to one year in particular, 2014, $5 billion. I mean, that's a huge number, right? The source points to this as crucial context. Top U.S. diplomat Victoria Nuland herself confirmed that America had spent over $5 billion to, in her words, support pro-democracy and pro-European outcomes in Ukraine.
Okay, and this is where it gets really interesting. This quote, "I think Yats is the guy," it's from a leaked phone call. It allegedly shows a top U.S. diplomat, Victoria Nuland again, discussing who should be in Ukraine's next government, basically hand-picking the leadership before the old one was even gone. The Yats she's talking about, that's Arseniy Yatsenyuk.
And here's how the source lays out the timeline of what happened next. First, you have a peace deal brokered by the EU. But the very next day, radical groups on the street reject it, and the elected president flees the country. And then what happens? A brand new, pro-Western government is put in place, and guess who's the new prime minister? Yats, the very guy from that phone call.
So, when you put all that together, the picture this analysis paints is that the Maidan uprising wasn't just a simple, spontaneous revolution. It's framed here as a US-backed coup. And the source argues that this event, this coup, is what directly lit the fuse for Russia's annexation of Crimea and the start of the war in the Donbass.
Okay, this next piece of the puzzle is huge because it leads to a really serious charge from the source, that the West, while talking all about a rules-based order, has a history of not exactly playing by those same rules.
What the source does here is pretty powerful. It puts Western interventions right next to Russian ones to highlight what it calls a glaring double standard. The argument is, look, when NATO bombed Serbia, it was for humanitarian intervention. When the US invaded Iraq, it was because of WMDs. The source claims Russia is just using the same playbook, but when they do it, it's condemned.
And then you get these really candid moments that the source jumps on. Here's John Bolton, a former US National Security Advisor, just casually admitting on TV that he's helped plan coups. The argument is, when you have high-level officials saying things like this, it makes it harder to claim the US doesn't interfere in other countries' politics.
So this all adds up to what the source calls a serious credibility problem. It basically asks, how can the US condemn Russia for violating international law when it launched the Iraq War without UN approval? Or when it rejects the authority of the International Criminal Court for its own actions? It's this pattern that, according to the analysis, weakens the West's moral authority.
But it's not just about geopolitics and hypocrisy. The analysis then says, if you really want to understand this, you got to follow the money. It points to some incredibly powerful economic interests that it claims are benefiting from this war.
So take a look at this. It's a breakdown of the US military budget. And the argument here is that a massive chunk, almost half of it, doesn't go to the troops or to military operations. Nope, it goes directly into the pockets of a few giant corporate defense contractors. And what's the result of all that spending? Well, here you go. A 40% increase in the stock price for a major weapons maker like Northrop Grumman. In the same year, the war in Ukraine kicked into high gear. It's presented as direct evidence of a massive financial windfall for the industry.
And this wasn't just a temporary stock market blip. We're talking about huge jumps in actual revenue for companies like General Dynamics. The source argues this creates a really perverse incentive. The longer the war goes on and the more weapons are sent, the more profit these companies make.
And it wasn't just the defense industry either. The war completely upended energy markets. Sanctions on Russia caused prices to spike, leading to $280 billion in windfall profits for the biggest Western oil and gas giants. Just an absolutely staggering number.
Okay, so we've walked through the whole argument. The NATO expansion, the turning point in 2014, the claims of hypocrisy, the profits of war. Let's bring it all together and see what the final conclusion of this analysis really is.
So the argument really boils down to these four key pillars. First, that NATO's expansion just kept pushing, knowingly crossing Russia's biggest security red lines. Second, that the US was not a bystander, but directly involved in the 2014 regime change. Third, that the West's own actions undermine the very rules-based order it champions. And finally, that there are powerful industries with a huge financial stake in this conflict continuing.
And so this all leads to one final, really provocative question that the source leaves us with. If this context is true, if this war was in fact provoked by this complex web of history, interference, and money, then what does that tell us about the real obstacles that are standing in the way of peace?